Do a bike ride this morning, eh? Charting a course to resilience for Friday morning. That's what it's about for today. Folks, thank you so much for last night. I hope you had a great time under the stars. We've added extra orange juice in the back there for you in case you need it, so feel free to get up and get some refreshments. Today we have some programming going on before you head to Greenwoods Conservation Park, where we have a lot of fun activities planned and a whole day set out that all the organizers are really excited to get you involved with. So a quick announcement before we dive into the programming is please take an opportunity to check out before we depart for Greenwood. So I'm guessing the hotel probably asked you to check out by around 12 noon, so be sure to do that. And the hotel staff will be happy to hold on to your luggage and suitcase so that when you get back from Greenwood, you can pick it up and then head to wherever you're heading, okay? So to kick things off, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dianne Saxe, the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. And a bit of background on Dr. Dianne Saxe. She's the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, a tough but fair watchdog over government compliance with the Environment Bill of Rights. Prior to her appointment in 2015, Commissioner Saxe was one of Canada's most respected environmental lawyers. A certified environmental law specialist, Commissioner Saxe was recognized in every Canadian and international legal rating service. Her 5-year appointment as Environmental Commissioner will be focused on serving the Ontario legislator, improving the effectiveness of the Environmental Bill of Rights, and catalyzing better environmental, energy, and climate outcomes for and with the people of Ontario. So please put your hands together as we welcome to the stage Dr. Saxe.
Short people. All right. Good morning, everybody. This looks like the survivors, everyone who made it through the evening. And I gather there was some amazing hula hooping last night. Thank you very much to Mr. Dickert and his team and to Mayor Parrish for organizing this event. I know that Mayor Parrish has done tireless work on algae, on water quality, on improving the waterfront of Ajax and the access to it, including by bicycle. Mayor Parrish and I bicycled that waterfront many years ago. And to Mayor Cooper, who I understand has just done amazing work greening Collingwood and is now going to lead this organization. I'm here today to talk to you about resilience and in face of the biggest challenge that all of us have, and that's climate change. But first, a couple of words about who I am and what I do, and then some ideas about things you folks can be working on. First of all, the Environmental Bill of Rights. This is a very unusual statute that we have here in Ontario. None of the other provinces has one. It's pretty unusual around the world, giving Ontarians the right to participate in significant environmental decisions by the Ontario government, and that may be increasingly important these days. As the Environmental Commissioner, I'm guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights, and I'm also required by law to provide nonpartisan reports to the Speaker of the Legislature and through him to the members and through them to you on these three quiet little topics: energy, environment, and climate. How many of you would find it helpful to have some nonpartisan, reliable facts to work with on climate issues? Okay, well that's my job. We do provide all of our reports on our website in both official languages. We also have a webinar in each one, and we have one-page summaries on each of the reports, and they're on the table outside. If you can use any of them for your community, for your events, if you've got public events this summer where you could put some out on a table, please let us know. We do this work at public expense, and we'd like people to be able to use it. Now, I spent a lot of time last year going around Ontario and other places talking to folks at all levels about climate change. And the most important thing that people need to understand is on this slide. Because most people think they have a pretty good sense of what's going on in climate change. Certainly I was an environmental and energy lawyer for 40 years before I became commissioner, and I thought I had a pretty good handle on it. And I've been absolutely blown away since I became commissioner as to how much worse it is, how much faster it's moving, how much it's already affecting everything we care about. And so I do ask people always, when you're thinking about how hard to push on climate issues, to first of all think about somebody that you love. Now, these two I am particularly fond of. I bought each of them their first bicycle, and I was very proud about introducing them to a life of cycling. And then I think about the kind of world that they're going to have, and it's pretty scary. Now, most people know the basics on climate, and I understand you had a presentation yesterday, and I'm going to try to go much more quickly than is comfortable through the basic science, because I also want to talk to you about what you can do. But basically, greenhouse gases are making it harder for heat to escape back into space, and that means that heat is building up in the Earth. The major greenhouse gas that humans emit is carbon dioxide, and you can see on the left-hand side of the slide how much carbon dioxide we were putting out every year in 1992, when the whole world agreed at the Earth Summit that climate change was an urgent economic, human, environmental problem, and we had to do something about it. And what have we done about it? So we're now putting carbon dioxide into the air at a rate faster than, as far as we can tell. The climate research that's been done over the last 30 years is the largest scientific collaboration in the history of humanity. And based on all of that research, there has never been this much CO2 going into the atmosphere. And where is it going? Well, about a quarter of it's going into the oceans, acidifying the oceans, which is damaging the basis of the food chain and the creatures that create half the oxygen that we breathe. About a third of it's in soil and vegetation, but won't necessarily stay there, because you can put a lot of carbon in a tree when you grow it, but you get it back when you burn it down or turn it into diapers. And the whole rest of it is in the atmosphere. And so the result is that we have the highest level of CO2 in the atmosphere in human history. Now, people do ask me about natural cycles. Anybody here think of some natural cycles? Ice ages, absolutely. Water levels, volcanoes, solar cycles, orbital wobbles, all of those kinds of things, they come and go. And they've come and go for millions of years. They've come and go through the history of the world. But throughout, as far as we can tell, certainly the last 800,000 years, probably the last many million years, CO2 was always in a very narrow range, between about 180 and 280 parts per million. And we blew past that more than a century and a half ago. And the highest level of CO2 that we can have in the atmosphere for long, our best guess, and still have the kind of world that existed when I was young, is 350. And you can see we blew past 350 in 1988. So if we wanted a world with, fairly predictable weather and the kind of weather that our crops are evolved for, and mountain glaciers and low-lying island states and those kinds of things, we need to keep CO2 at 350, and now we're permanently over 400. Now, how many people here are from evidence-based professions? Okay, lots of good reasons to have evidence-based professions, but you can only get evidence from the past. And what happened to humans the last time CO2 was over 400? We don't know. There have never been humans when CO2 was over 400. And it takes about a generation between the time that we put carbon dioxide in the air and the time that we start to experience the effects. So we're now starting to experience the effects of being over 350. Our kids for sure are going to be living with over 400. And we're still putting CO2 in the atmosphere at the fastest rate it has ever happened. Now, it's not just CO2 that's trapping heat. As you can see from this chart, we're also trapping a lot of heat from methane, a lot of which is from animal agriculture and from oil and gas. We're putting a lot of heat in from nitrous oxide, from nitrogen fertilizer, and also from other chemical procedures. And the rest of it's from refrigerants. Single most important thing anybody can do is not let any more refrigerants leak into the atmosphere, whether from your air conditioning systems, your arenas, your refrigerators, because they can last for tens of thousands of years and be 50,000 times worse than carbon dioxide. But you put all that extra heat, you trap extra heat for all that time, what we start getting is we're blowing away temperature records all around the world. So that dark red is temperature areas where record temperatures were hit in the summer of 2016. How many blue areas do you see? There's a few. Do you know what they are? Those are the ice caps melting. Those are the lids of cold, fresh water on the surface of the salt water interfering with the ocean currents. So one of the ways I can sum all this up is this. When bad news happens, what I have observed people do is they want to hang on and wait for normal to come back, right? You get a cancer diagnosis, you lose a job, whatever happens, you want normal to come back. And normal cannot come back. By normal, what we usually mean, what our laws mean, what our infrastructure standards mean, our culvert sizes, our half-load seasons, all of that is basically the average of the 20th century. And the average of the 20th century is that zero line. And we don't live there anymore. And it cannot come back because this only shows you what has already happened. This does not yet show you how much more heat we have locked in by the emissions that we have already emitted into the atmosphere and how much we're continuing to emit today. Now, all that extra heat, where is it? Well, very little of it, only about 1% is in the air, the weather that we feel. And this is averaged over the entire globe, and the world is big. Now, you can see that world temperatures go up and down. They flop around a lot. It doesn't go up smoothly the way the CO2 chart does. But even so, eventually it does go up. As the heat builds up, the temperature has to go up. But where's the rest of the heat? So if you look at the chart at the left, those of you with really good eyes, you can see a tiny little red line at the bottom. Can you see the tiny little red line at the bottom? People at the back? Yes? Can you see it? Okay, if you can't see, you're going to have to take my word for it. There's a tiny little red line at the bottom of that chart. And what's that? That is showing you, this is the extra heat that's built up in the world, and this has essentially all happened in my lifetime. The red shows you what's built up in the air. The green shows you what's built up in soil and vegetation. The white shows you what's built up melting ice. And all the rest of it, about 93%, is in the water, most of that in the oceans. And about 70% of that, based on the best research we have now, is in the water around Antarctica. So what's that doing to the ice? Antarctica's lost 3 trillion tons of ice already, and the rate of loss is accelerating dramatically. And there's a lot of ice in Antarctica. So what happens? You put all that much heat in the water. Anybody remember grade 3, what happens when you warm up water? Well, the first thing is it gets bigger, right? Warm air expands, warm water expands. What happens to sea level when you expand the oceans? Does it matter if you believe in it? What else happens when you heat up the oceans? Any engineers in the crowds? Okay, so storms are heat engines. The more heat you put into a heat engine, the more powerful, the faster it grows, the more powerful it is. And also warmer water holds less oxygen, which is not good if you're trying to breathe. But everything I've said to you so far is about averages. Any statisticians, any mathematicians here? If your head is in the oven and you've got third-degree burns and your feet are in the freezer and you've got frostbite, on average you're great, right? It's not the averages that do most of the damage, it's the extremes. And the biggest thing that climate change brings us is more extremes. So you see a picture on the left of a road melting in India in the sun. What's happening already? Well, we know the winds are getting stronger. So this is Puerto Rico last fall. I think you all know Puerto Rico was pretty much completely destroyed by Hurricane Maria, and there's been very limited recovery ever since then. But it's not just there. I was in Georgian Bay a couple of days ago, and they were telling me that they had 15-minute sustained hurricane force winds last year. And then you just have to look at the 3 immensely damaging storms we've had in the GTA just since the beginning of this year. We know that extreme events have already tripled even in Canada and the United States. Remember that young person you said you loved? Well, we don't want them in a car driven by a person who's been drinking, because they're about 3 to 4 times more likely to have a crash. Well, we have already increased the frequency of extreme events about 3 times, even for those of us who are the luckiest in the world in North America, and we haven't yet experienced what we've locked in, and our kids are in this car with us, and they've got nowhere else to go. Ontario's warming faster than world average. Arctic is warming particularly quickly, but it's different in different places. Growing seasons are going in some places in Ontario 13 days a decade, which is lightning speed if you're a tree or a bridge. And in some places it's not growing at all. So the impacts can be very local. But we're certainly seeing a lot of impacts already. You know about the drought in 2016, where the fire wells went dry in significant parts of Ontario. And does anybody here have a drought plan yet? In 2016, there wasn't a single municipality in Ontario with a drought plan. 2017, drought wasn't the problem. Another thing in 2017 people didn't notice, you saw all the pictures of the fires on the West Coast. We didn't have the fires here, but well, except in Geraldton, but we still had the smoke. The smoke blows right across the continent, especially the very fine particles, and the very fine particles are the ones that do the most lung damage. And we also had these incredible temperature whipsaws. So we're breaking temperature wave after temperature wave. So this was the winter heat wave in February 2017. Then there was an incredible freeze in December and January and February. You see the lizards that fell out of the trees from the cold. We had the extraordinary heat wave in February this year. Then we had the deep freeze again. So we're getting these whipsaws, which are very, very hard for both built infrastructure and living systems to cope with. We see it starting to show up in the insurance losses. This is adjusted to constant dollars, so there's no inflation in these figures. And of course, we have already the first epidemic of climate change, and more people are being affected. I mean, even the executive director of Pollution Probe got Lyme disease last year and can't work. And I'm taking my 3-year-old grandson to the woods for his very first canoe trip next weekend, and I am now terrified about Lyme disease. I never had to worry about that when I took my kids. I never had to worry about that when I was a kid. The world's changing. So what's ahead? Well, now we're into computer models. It's always hard to make predictions about the future, but it's really a question of when, not if. We do know that the cities that are farther to the north will have the biggest temperature impacts. We know that on the impacts around the world on climate change, cities and infrastructure are particularly strongly affected. We know that it's a question of when, not if, in terms of losing ice roads, losing winter, losing the reliability of winter. Probably means wetter springs, certainly means hotter, drier summers on average. You know, more of the things that makes your life really difficult. Storms and floods and droughts and winds and fire, and then, of course, the incredible invasion of invasive species. We also know it means more health effects. Lyme disease is just the beginning. Heat stress, certainly a major impact. Just think of all of the portables that were built, the school portables, with no air conditioning, because we didn't ever need air conditioning. When the standards were developed, we didn't need air conditioning in June and September, and the really hot weather came in August when the kids weren't there. How many of you have garages or other facilities where people have to work in conditions that now get really hot? Anybody? We know that we've had an enormous improvement in air pollution in Ontario with the closure of the coal plants. But as the heat increases, air pollution gets worse because they affect each other. And we also know that the hotter and drier the places are, the quicker the impacts will become overwhelming. There we're lucky. All of us around the Great Lakes, we're lucky. We are still going to have drinking water when other people don't. We're still going to be able to grow food when other people don't. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to let us sit here in our splendid isolation while tens of millions of people in other places can't. And the carbon budget is running out, which means that probably If we wanted a 2/3 chance of staying below 2 degrees, which means a fairly manageable kind of world, then most of the fossil fuel reserves that have been traded on the stock market today can never be burned. And that's not reflected yet in the stock markets. It's not reflected yet in Canada's economy. We've got a lot of changes ahead. And on top of that, it's no longer just about us. So in 1992 at the Earth Summit, if the world's peoples had got serious, if we really had brought our greenhouse gas emissions down and that probably would have been enough. But now, even if we stopped burning fossil fuels tomorrow, and I don't think that's very likely because 85% of the world economy and 80% of Ontario's economy are still dependent on fossil fuels, even if we stopped tomorrow, would it be enough? Well, maybe not, because we are reaching tipping points in the natural world that once they're gone, we're not going to be able to control. And so throughout my working life, every senior decision maker I've ever known has always been really, really busy. Any of you get up to work in the morning and wonder what you're going to do all day? Every senior decision maker I've ever known, especially in public service, has always had a desk full of emergencies. And so big, slow-moving, difficult, widespread kind of issues like climate change tend to get put off. You know, someone really should deal with this after we deal with this emergency. We'll get to this after we get through this emergency, and that's been the story the whole 40 years of my career. So then I say to people, well, what would it take for you to notice when climate change became the biggest emergency we had? Or are we just going to be boiling frogs and never notice? What would it look like on a chart? And I think it might look like this. Now, admittedly, you know, charts aren't all that exciting, but let me tell you what we're looking at. This is a summary of all the global sea ice measurements ever taken. Now, it's not total amount of ice. The thickness of ice has collapsed much more quickly than shown on this. But it's which parts of the ocean have ice on them. And that's really important because it's a feedback loop. When the sun falls on ice, what happens? Most of it's reflected. When sun falls on water, what happens? Most of it absorbed as heat. So the more ice we melt, the more heat the oceans absorb. The more heat the oceans absorb, the more ice we melt. Is this something we can stop by just saying to it, stop? Anybody here be able to stop that with a bylaw? But once it starts, we can't get it back. And what you can see on this chart, I mean, I can't go and point to it the way I like to, is that we lost ice over the decades, but by and large, the basic pattern didn't break until September 2016. And that's when we started seeing catastrophic losses of ice in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. Did you notice? You all know that in the Arctic, the sun goes down in October and it doesn't come back up until, basically March, right? So February is dark, cold, midwinter. Did you notice when 1/3 of the ice on the Bering Sea melted this February? In the dark. And what else is coming? There's a lot of people affected. And we know that the impacts of climate change are uneven. We know that by and large, the vulnerable suffer the most and have the hardest time recovering. If you have a big loss and you have insurance and you have savings, well, you claim on your insurance and, maybe you lost things that you really care about, but you can still recover and keep going. If everything you own is in a basement apartment and you don't have enough money for insurance and that gets flooded out, what have you got? And the UK experience is that a lot of people at the bottom of the economic ladder, if they get a flood or a fire or a windstorm and they lose everything, they've got nowhere to go except on welfare, and they fall back onto the responsibility of the municipality just when the municipality is least able to deal with it. And it can also lead to conflict. If people have nothing less to lose, are they going to just sit there and let the rest of us be comfortable? Maybe not. So is it too late? I mean, this is the big question, right? People always ask me, is it too late? And I have to say, too late for what? Is it too late for that young person that you love to have the same world that we had? Yeah, it's too late for that. We blew that one. Is it too late to avoid your municipality having to face difficult decisions and tough changes? Yeah, it's too late for that. Is it too late to make a difference in what's coming and in how well we cope with it? It's not too late for that. We're in that moment right now. In 2016, the Secretary General of the United Nations said, we've got 5 years, maybe 10 to choose a future. And we're in that right now. And municipalities, you're on the front lines. I mean, you know you're on the front lines. You don't need me to tell you that. You own most of the infrastructure. You're the easiest government to sue, at least in Canada. You're very visible. People know you when you go to the grocery store. People can find you there. You've got limited financial resources. You've got limited numbers of people. You've got limited control. You know, I keep hearing this sort of joke. The federal government has the money. The provincial government has the laws and regulations, and you've got the problems. That sound familiar? You've got lots of aging infrastructure. And you've got growing populations in many places and growing demands. And people's very high expectations that you're going to solve it all for them. So I don't have a magic wand, but here's maybe a way to think about it. 4 pillars of climate resilience. Number 1, mitigation. We have to reduce our emissions, all of us, every person, every organization. We should be trying to reduce our emissions 5% a year every year. It's a huge challenge, but the consequences if we don't are overwhelming. We need to adapt. We have to prepare for what's coming. It's coming fast. And, you know, the old thing, a stitch in time saves 9. A lot of those old rules, they're right, and we need to start paying attention to them. The 3rd pillar is growth, right? One of your responsibilities is for the economic well-being of the people in your community. And there is a lot of good news that we can milk out of the climate story. There are a lot of win-wins. Ontario spends $11 billion a year importing fossil fuels. That does absolutely nothing to create a single job in Ontario, to create any kind of economic finesse. That's all money that we're pouring out of the window year after year after year after year. If we got even 10% more efficient and we kept an extra $1 billion circulating in the economy, we would have more employment here. We would have more opportunities for innovators here. If we had, the biggest threat to human health in most municipalities today is air pollution from fossil-fueled vehicles. If we get more of those vehicles off fossil fuels, get more people cycling, electric, clean transit, we will have better air quality. That means better public health. It means less destruction of public infrastructure. And there's even a very preliminary study that I saw in Germany in November that when the air quality is better, people are happier and they go shopping more. So, right? And communication. There is a real crisis in trust. People have lost faith in their institutions, and there's a lot of reasons every day for people to lose faith in institutions, but they, at the same time, can't know everything themselves, and they need to know who they can trust. And if you can be one of those voices, giving truthful, helpful, honest information to people, that can help them. Lots of people want to know what they should do. So, lots of examples, and I don't have time to go through all of these slides, so they are all going to be available on the website soonish, I guess. In the Ontario context, we do have some specific advantages, and the big advantage we have is we have a very clean electrical supply. Only 4% of our electricity came from fossil fuels last year. So that means that, and we have a tremendous opportunity to convert other fossil fuel uses to electricity, reducing our emissions, keeping more money in Ontario. I know that electricity is expensive, but it's also very efficient. So I have a plug-in car, and the operating costs are like almost nothing. If you have a vehicle that you drive a lot, the more you drive it, the more you save by having it electric instead of fossil fuels. Cap and trade has been a tremendous opportunity. We have a strong economy. We have a very educated, motivated population. We have really good communications tools. We do have a cold climate, but then we can learn from other people who've done better than we have. Like Sweden, just as cold there as here, they've reduced the amount of energy they use in buildings by 84% since the oil price shocks. We've got low average population densities, but that's growing fast, and certainly around the Great Lakes, province is planning to add another 4.5 million people in this area in the next 25 years. But our biggest problem is that for half a century we have planned and built as if land was inexhaustible and petroleum products were inexhaustible, cheap, and that it didn't matter how much of it we used. And neither of those things are true. We do also have new powers for municipalities. Last year, all Ontario municipalities got powers for the first time to adopt bylaws on climate change. Climate change is now a matter of provincial interest. There's long-term energy plan, green development standards, so new powers, and I'm waiting for the first municipality in Ontario to get innovative and do something with this. We're at a time where really the initiative is shifting to the municipalities. It looks as if, well, I don't know what the provincial government's going to do, but I suspect that initiative's going to be up to you folks, and you've got now the power to do it. So the 4 pillars. Number 1 is mitigation. Now we're talking about an incredibly dramatic change in the basis of our economy in a fairly short period of time, and no one has the answer to this. This takes everybody's thoughtfulness, creativity, working together, collaboration. What matters absolutely most, though, is land use and transportation. Low density, spread out development has a huge carbon footprint. It inevitably has a carbon footprint because if you live a long way from work and you've got no other way to get to work but to drive, you're going to be driving, you're going to be using an awful lot of energy to do that. So that's your biggest impact. And when you make decisions on planning, they have a huge, huge consequence. And really the point here is that emissions lock in. If you make a planning decision that results in a forest or a grassland becoming a low-density subdivision, that is locking in high emissions for centuries. Those kinds of land use changes are almost impossible to reduce. So what you do really matters and will continue to matter for a long time. There are lots of other things that help. I mean, for example, think about municipal operations. Who here would like to have lower costs in your municipal operations? Okay, so would you like to spend less on fossil fuels? There's lots of opportunities to do that. The new municipal asset management regulation in Ontario is going to compel municipalities to think about energy costs for the first time in a way that wasn't done before. The province forced municipalities for many years, half a century really, to do your capital budgeting in terms of initial capital cost, because the senior levels of government were providing some of that initial capital cost, and they were interested in the lowest possible initial capital cost. And that pushed municipalities in many cases to build things that were cheap to build, because the feds would help pay for that, but very expensive to run, because you would pay for that. This will start changing. We know that energy intensity in public buildings is all over the place. We did a study on this a couple of years ago, and what we showed is that there are huge potential savings. Now, not every building can be as good as every other building, but if you could get all existing public sector buildings to be basically top quartile, then there could be savings of about $450 million a year in utility bills. And I see a lot of examples of this as I go around the province. I was at the Royal Victoria Hospital yesterday looking at some of the things they've done, and they're saving money in their operations, they're reducing their emissions, and they're finding it easier to operate the hospital and safer and more comfortable for people as well. Water and wastewater is a huge opportunity. We did a special report on this last year. You probably know that for most municipalities, about 1/3 to 40% of their energy goes just to pushing water around. Water is really heavy. And a really remarkable thing is that water and wastewater utilities have the potential to be really energy efficient, to move loads off peak, because you've got large tanks, you can move things around, and yet they had improved their efficiency only 1/10 as fast as the average Ontario consumer, and let me tell you, the average Ontario consumer is no one to write home about. There's electric vehicles. I already mentioned some of the real potential savings for municipal vehicles. If you have electric vehicles, because they do have such low operating costs, they are more expensive to buy, But you guys aren't just interested in the initial capital cost, you're interested in the total cost. And you keep things a long time and you drive them a lot. So if you take account of the savings in operating costs, you can save quite a lot, as well as improving air quality and setting a good example. And then there's the whole question about electric vehicle charging. Somebody like me, I can charge in my car, plug in my car in my own driveway. But on my daughter's street, there aren't any driveways. Are you going to make it possible to charge electric vehicles, say, at the streetlights, or in public parking lots, or at workplaces? What are you going to do to make that more possible? There's the electric buses pilot, and I will also say transit buses is one thing. I was told, I'm not sure this is right, but I was told there are 7,000 transit buses in Ontario. Anybody want to guess how many school buses? 22,000. And who goes on school buses? Children. Who is the most sensitive to air pollution from burning diesel? Who would get the biggest health benefit from being in a clean bus? Right? And also, school buses start and stop and start and stop and start and stop, so really benefit from regenerative braking, and they don't run all day. So they are almost ideal for electrification. You charge them, you use them for a few hours, and then you can charge them again. So tremendous opportunities to help protect the health of our kids. And you know, also think about where the buses idle. They idle right in front of the school. Wouldn't you rather have that bus, a clean bus, than one that's putting pollutants into the air of those kids? And those particles, they go deep in the lungs and they stay there for life sometimes. Organics in landfill. You probably all know when organics go to landfill, they rot, they release methane. Methane's about 100 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of causing climate change. It also is a completely wasted resource. Methane is natural gas. Methane is a source of energy. Methane is something that, so who knows which municipality in Ontario is using biogas, admittedly from, human waste, to run their buses. Hamilton. What about the rest of you? Sudbury, Stratford has got an experiment to co-digest organic waste diverted from municipal waste collection with their sewage sludge, so that they can get high enough BOD to economically collect biogas. And then once you have the biogas, there's lots of things you can do with it. And then there's a whole thing I call fun with bylaws. So what can you do with bylaws? One simple thing you can do is think about not requiring people to have the heat on in June. Right? That may not make good sense anymore. You've got to think about emergency cooling, but you can also think about energy benchmarking, energy efficiency. How many of you have the energy consumption of your municipal buildings posted in the lobby? Every English public building does. How many of you post it on your website? Well, why not? Why aren't you benchmarking your buildings? Why aren't your buildings competing with each other to be more energy efficient? How many of you even went to the map when we posted it of the energy use in every public building in Ontario to see how you compare with your neighbors? Lots of people like to compete. Harness it. Make it work. Net buildings, finding ways to make it easier to encourage building owners and operators to generate energy on their own sites and to be more efficient. And there's all kinds of ways you can do this. I talked to a major property owner, and they organize competitions between the different floors in their building, and whoever reduces their peak energy consumption the most, they get a round of free ice cream. It is amazing how hard people will work for a round of free ice cream. Lots of things in transportation, lots of examples around the world of municipalities using their powers to keep high-emitting vehicles out of their central areas, partly for noise, partly for air quality. How pleasant is it on your downtown street when it's choking and it's loud? Do people want to spend time on your street when it's like that? Or are they more likely to do it if it's quiet and pleasant and the air's clean? There's social marketing effects. So North Vancouver was the first municipality in Canada to use its power, bylaw power, to require warning labels on gas tanks, on service stations. There's lots of things you can do on mitigation. Adaptation, got to think about the big things that are coming: heat, drought, wind, floods, fire. It affects your operations for sure. It also affects your city as a whole. And think about it. I mean, who picks up the pieces when there's massive devastation? The senior levels of government help a bit, but the long-term consequences are left for you folks. And you need to prepare, and you need to help people prepare. And there's also the huge mental health impacts that people have. Lots of research now on how much money you can save by better management of sun and rain. Cool roofs, cool pavements, making it possible. You know, where are people going to go when it's really hot? Is there a safe way for people to get from their homes to cooling centers, to pools, to shopping, where the pavement isn't as hot? We haven't paid much attention to that here. Much more work being done in Australia, but we're going to need it. We're going to have far more extremely hot days. And then the whole question, how do we keep our trees alive? With the combined effect of salt and compaction and invasive species and drought, and then the kind of storms we have this week, what would your cities be like if you lost your trees? You don't want to wait till it happens and then try to do catch up. Stormwater, a really big issue. The central axis of mitigation, reducing emissions, is energy, but the central axis of adaptation is water. And the first place that that's going to hit is stormwater. We already have a roughly $6.8 billion stormwater deficit in Ontario. We tend not to fund stormwater infrastructure correctly. We do it with either property taxes or water rates. Both of those are proven to be ineffective, inefficient, and they don't give private property owners any incentive to keep the water on their land. We need to recognize that it is not possible anymore for stormwater to be a public problem to be paid with on public money on public land. It's a shared problem. The water, most of the water has to stay where it falls. Mississauga is one of the examples, Kitchener, Waterloo, London, Markham, others. You know, if people have a financial incentive, parking lots, why should they be able to pay almost nothing, well, pay nothing for stormwater management and create an enormous burden for everybody else in the city? Green roofs, tremendous advantage in a number of different ways. One of the things that exacerbates climate change is the urban heat island effect. That is, the heat that is absorbed by dark pavement and roofs and then reflected back, increasingly making it hard to sleep with these tropical nights when it's over about 20 degrees C. It's much harder to sleep if you don't have air conditioning. And we're expecting a significant increase in those kinds of nights, and that exacerbates social inequality. Because who are the kids who are trying to sleep without air conditioning? How well will they do in school the next day? We know that it increases the risk of violence if people can't sleep. So green roofs, they reduce the urban heat island effect. They can also clean the water. They provide insulation for the buildings they're on. They're beautiful. They provide habitat for wild creatures. And then innovation, how are you going to grow your economy? I mean, a lot of the things I've already talked about, you could also think of as ways of innovation. There is an obvious overlap, but I'd really say, is it easy to innovate in your city? Is your city welcoming and encouraging for people who come up with ways to mitigate or adapt or communicate? Do you recognize and thank those people? Do you set up ways for them to meet each other? Is your municipality a place where it's easy or hard to do these kinds of innovations? And are your staff encouraged to think of ways to make it easier for folks to do good things? The Ontario Public Service circulated an exhortation from the Secretary of Cabinet a few months ago. The civil servants need to feel safe to innovate and to take risks. Now, whether they will continue to do so, I don't know. But what about your municipality? Do your public servants feel empowered to innovate, to try new things? They won't all work. But if they're not, how are you going to get the new economy? And anyway, a few examples. Right, so there aren't any toilets on the bus, honestly, but I already told you about the TTC buses in Hamilton, the public buses in Hamilton. But Hamilton, you know, Canadians were much too shy. We don't paint it on the buses, so I use the British picture because they're using the same biogas, but they're not so shy about what it is. But, you know, you could tell, if you're doing great things, why don't you tell people? If you're doing good things in your municipality about climate, are they on your website? Is your municipal greenhouse gas footprint on your website? Are you know, a lot of Canadians are kind of shy about their accomplishments. And they assume that if they're doing good things, other people know, and if you know something, everybody else knows it, and you don't need to speak up because somebody else will speak up, and I don't know, maybe somebody will criticize you. This is the time to talk about your successes and maybe your failures, because other people can learn about your failures too. What are you doing about climate change? What have you tried? Where are you going next? Tell those stories. They're very powerful. So communication absolutely is a critical pillar. There's lots of good science now on good communication with the public, starting with informing, going all the way to empowerment. And I would say think about your own staff first. They're your best ambassadors. They know best what your operations are. They know best what the challenges are. And if anybody's got ideas as to how you can improve it, they're probably a place to start. So putting all of that together, you know, I always say to people, well, who here would like to have some hope for our kids? I would. Well, how do we get hope? I only know of one formula. Who thinks here that just closing our eyes and pretending it isn't happening is a good formula? I haven't seen it work at anything else. I think the only formula that works is to start with the facts. The facts aren't pretty, but they're still the facts. But then we can't just stop there, because then it's just too depressing, and everybody feels helpless. What we have to do then is look at each other and find ways that we can do with each other, with our peers, with our colleagues, with our constituents, and say, what can we do together about this? Because there is actually a lot that we can do. So, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Saxe. Yeah, we're going to do a Q&A now, and I'm going to get John to moderate that. So, folks, if you want to head to the mics on either side of the room, one on this side and one on this side, you'll be able to ask Commissioner Saxe any questions, and I'll hand it to John to guide which side we'll go.
Excuse me.
Yes, yes,
All right. First of all, since I have the mic, I get first question. First, Dr. Saxe, that was amazing. It was an incredible presentation, and I can't thank you enough for being here. So when we look at the data, oftentimes we get depressed, frustrated, anxious, all the things that you can imagine that leaders like we have here are. When you looked at, you've had the opportunity to look at other countries and other successful opportunities, whether it's been in Sweden or Germany or wherever. And I guess the one question is it the information that drove people to a point where they demanded change? Because as you know, south of us here in my home state or home country, they have chosen to ignore it. Some people have chosen to ignore it. Or is it the leadership that is bold enough to stand up and say, no, we're going to do this because it matters and we see the data and we have to?
You know, I've seen every kind of arrangement. There's no single answer. Sometimes you get a brave leader. It's interesting, actually, because when I'm in public meetings or with non-governmental organizations, they always say, why aren't there any brave politicians? And I say, do they get reelected? Right? And some do. So sometimes it's a specific leader who says, you know, we are going to talk about this. This is really important to us, and also looks at the advantages. How are we going to reduce our operating expenses and so on? Sometimes it's groups of citizens who find ways to be really effective. Very often it's some combination. So I was in Parry Sound, I can't remember what day anymore, a few days ago, and they brought together the mayor, the local biosphere reserve, a First Nations representative, some business people, you know, a whole range of folks, a school principal, to talk together, and they're from different parties, so the local MPP was there, to talk together about, all right, how can we move forward together? Which things can we agree on? And it's not always an easy conversation, but because they make a real effort to recognize they all love the same place. They all love their kids. They're all trying to do the right thing as they understand it, and they're very respectful to each other. They're able to get things done. And I think it's that kind of sitting down together, having a civil discourse, and understanding each other's challenges, and then looking for ways to help each other. That's where I think the real progress happens.
Nicola?
Is this on? Yep. Commissioner Saxe, a couple of months ago I was able to do a series of interviews with some GTA mayors, including Mayor Parrish, to ask them specifically about what the challenges were in introducing more climate change mitigation initiatives within their communities. And what I found fascinating was climate change is a global issue, and they are local mayors, and their citizens are interested in local issues. And so the communications challenge is in making it a local issue. And some of the mayors were saying that they get an awful lot of pushback, even on things like bike paths, something that you would think was fairly straightforward, that is a colossal fight at council just to get a bike path. And so we were talking about what is the best way to communicate, and it seemed to be around what would benefit people. So I seized on what you were saying about the health of the children, air quality, focusing on air quality, focusing on nature, focusing on natural spaces, seems to be they're much more receptive to that kind of message. So I guess my question is, what have you heard in your travels throughout the province from elected officials of what messaging works, or what advice would you have?
Yeah. I certainly agree with you that it's hard to motivate people to act on something that's big and where they think it will mostly matter to polar bears or Bangladeshis or, someone somewhere else later. People are mostly motivated by what matters to them now, and most people still think that climate change doesn't matter to them now. So I spend a lot of time looking at the changes that are already starting to happen, the Lyme disease, the flooding, the windstorms, the heat impacts, and looking for data about local impacts. You think about the farmers. Longer growing season can be helpful, but the absolute whiplash in terms of unpredictability makes their lives very difficult. So I think that's one of the reasons I talk about health a lot. This slide, which is about the win-wins. A green community, people like living in a green community. We have lots of data that people are happier in a green community. You have more social trust. You have less petty crime. You have a better community when it's beautiful and it's green. And well, what does it take to maintain that? And a lot of that is consistent with the same things that reduce fossil fuels. So, I mean, that's one of the things that motivates people most is what matters to us here, and health is a big one, and nature, connection with the nature is a big one. Working with your neighbors to protect something you love is a big one. That's, much as I know.
Okay,
yes.
over on our left, sir.
Huh? Pardon? Oh. How important for you, do you think, in your own opinion, is cap and trade? Now that the new provincial government is going to try scrapping that out.
Well, I don't know what the new government is going to do. It was certainly part of their platform to scrap cap and trade. And I think that will be a very sad day for Ontario. As I reported in January, cap and trade has worked exceptionally well, and it's provided an incentive for investments in Ontario, such as the new all-electric mine that Goldcorp is building. It's also provided more than $2 billion, which is going to things like, I mentioned, the Royal Victoria Hospital. They got $1 million last year to improve their energy efficiency, and they also, the way they did it, also significantly improved patient comfort. So to cut that off, we know that from ample evidence around the world that putting a price on carbon is the most cost-effective way of reducing emissions. It triggers all kinds of innovation and incentives. Now, as if we lose cap and trade and we get the federal backstop, that still puts a price on carbon. It puts a much higher price on carbon, so that's a shock for a number of the industries that are energy intensive, which could be challenging to manage. But at least it's still a price on carbon.
Okay, last question. Mayor?
Well, thank you very much for speaking. It's been very exciting. One thing you did not mention was heating of houses. And it seems that Ontario does it the wrong way. It would be very nice if we perhaps switched to electric heating. We just, of course, 30 years ago got rid of electric heating and went to fossil. I mean, clearly, if the way forward is to reduce fossil fuel, that would be one area that should be looked at.
So the first question for me is always making homes more energy efficient before we change the heating source.
And I agree.
And we have enormous opportunities to do that. And again, if you think about urban form, it takes a lot more energy to heat 100 single-family houses spread apart than it does the same number of townhouses or the same number of apartments. One of the things that Sweden did, which allowed it so dramatically reduce its energy consumption in buildings, is have more grouped housing, townhouses and low rises and so on, where you're sharing a wall with someone. In terms of how we heat the homes, you're absolutely right. We are going to have to significantly not only reduce the carbon footprint of natural gas, but also reduce the amount of natural gas that we use. That's challenging because right now natural gas is at historically low prices and electricity in Ontario is more expensive. But there are a number of ways of doing it that are more efficient, and particularly using electricity at night. Prince Edward Island, for example, saved quite a lot of money by funding 300 thermal electric furnaces in people's homes to replace diesel heat, and that allowed them to dramatically increase the use of their wind power. So there are many different ways to approach it. I did mention energy benchmarking and so on, which is an important way of moving towards buildings. The real thing we need to know is where are the key energy uses in your municipality and what can you do about it? Transportation is for most people, absolutely the easier way to start. Gasoline is much more carbon intensive than natural gas. And we have really good alternatives for gas-fired transportation for lots of people and lots of circumstances. So generally my view is let's start with what's easier and has co-benefits first and keep an eye on the ones that are going to be harder.
The issue I have when you talk about changing housing and things like that, there is so much existing stock that is more than difficult to find a way to insulate and do the proper things you're talking about.
Right. Well, one of the great things that I picked out in my climate report in terms of the use of the greenhouse gas money, the cap and trade money, is providing for energy efficiency upgrades in public housing. So we have a really shameful record in this province of throwing up all this public housing in the 60s and early 70s and then providing no money to maintain those buildings. So they are extremely energy inefficient. They're uncomfortable to live in. They're cold in the winter. They're hot in the summer. They've got all kinds of leaks. And there has never been public money to fix these buildings and make them energy efficient. And so now, again, last year I toured a couple of public housing buildings in Sudbury, and they really have winter in Sudbury, where they've been able to use money from cap and trade to significantly upgrade the building envelopes and the heating systems in those buildings. So much more comfort and dignity for the people who live there, much lower operating costs for the city. We need to make these changes, and our housing is so inefficient. We have lots of room for improvement.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our speaker.
All right, folks, we are going to move into a break as well as a free-flowing networking session with Commissioner Saxe. So she'll be over.